Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming on this beautiful but hot day to the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here in the two Mississippi Museums complex. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to History is Lunch, and if you have not already, please silence your cell phones. We have a sign-up sheet over there for our email list. If you are not already on it and you're interested in getting a weekly email reminder about the programs, you can give us your email address and we'll be glad to add you to that list. A few announcements before we get into today's program. I note with sadness the death of Dorothy Stewart Samuel, an educator, historian, the founder of Women for Progress, and she participated in several History is Lunch programs over the years. We will miss her, a real force in Jackson and across the state. And I hope that you will be able to join us here next week when St. Louis University law professor Anders Walker will be with us to discuss his new book, The Burning House, Jim Crow and the Making of Modern America. Today, though, we are delighted to have Julian Rankin with us to discuss his new book, Catfish Dream, Ed Scott's Fight for His Family Farm and Racial Justice in the Mississippi Delta. Julian Rankin was raised in Oxford and the Mississippi Delta before moving to North Carolina. He earned his BA in English and Creative Writing from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and completed operations and marketing internships with the United States Senate and CNN. Rankin is the recipient of the Southern Foodways Alliance's inaugural residency at Rivendell Writers Colony and the founding director of the Center for Art and Public Exchange at the Mississippi Museum of Art. Help me welcome Julian Rankin.
Thank you. How's everyone doing today? Good. So I just wanted to start by just saying that this project, this book that just now launched last week has been a really important moment and chapter in my life, and I've learned a lot about myself and a lot about Mississippi. And as you can see, there's Catfish Dream, the title, there's a lot that's packed into that. And this is the life of an extraordinary family, an extraordinary man, Ed Scott Jr., and some of the family members will be here today or in the audience. So I just wanted to recognize the importance of that story and that this story, although Ed Scott is no longer with us, this story continues as stories do throughout the generations. So as I mentioned, this is the book. This is published by University of Georgia Press, and it's part of a series they do with the Southern Foodways Alliance. And the Southern Foodways Alliance is part of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture at Ole Miss. The series called Studies in Culture, People, and Place. So I want to start with just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about so you can get a sense of why it's called Catfish Dream and what that all means.
My motto is, don't stop chasing your dreams, that's what I'm dreaming. The world is catfish we got here. Feel I feel like a catfish, swimming deep down in the sea. I have no more words on my little girl looking out after me, looking out after me, looking out after me, looking out after me. Well, I'm broke, baby, I'm hungry, baby, I'm ready now, dirty few. But if I clean up this woman, get out, stay all night, stay all night, stay all night, stay all night. If you're on the bottom, what way is this way to go but up? If I can come in, baby, let me sit down.
So Ed Scott began this journey a long time before the Catfish plant opened. So the high point of this story really is him becoming the first non-white owner-operator of a catfish plant in the nation. And that was in 1983. But this goes all the way back. He was born in 1922. And before Ed Scott Jr., there was an Ed Scott Sr., as you might imagine. And Ed Scott Sr. was a really important figure and began this journey. And throughout the process, both of them shared an aspiration to create and own an enterprise, to buy land, and to have access to a truly free market that would not discriminate against them. And that was something that they succeeded at, but that kept running up against obstacles. So Ed Scott Sr., he came and brought his family to Mississippi from Alabama in 1919. And as Ed Scott Jr. told me, it took 9 years of working shares in Glendora, which is in the Mississippi Delta, a small farming community, before he saved up enough to buy his first piece of land. And this is Ed Scott Sr. and Juanita Scott, Ed Scott Jr.'s parents. And another kind of interesting story, apparently when they got here, Juanita was not too happy with the reception that they got in Mississippi, and so she wanted to go home to Alabama. Not that it was that great there either, but Ed Scott Sr. has a quote. He said, I believe I could stay in hell one year if I knew I could move out the next. And I think that just speaks to the persistence and determination of this family that knew that many people struggled and there was a lot to overcome, but that they were determined to stick it out and to do what needed to be done to make that happen. So I'll go ahead and give a shout out to the Sunflower County Library where I sourced this oral history, but this is Ed Scott again, giving a little bit of this backstory in his own words.
I started with my father, and I give him and the Lord credit for everything I've done here. My daddy came from Alabama in 1919 as a sharecropper, and he bought his first piece of land in 1928, just before the Depression, which I was a little boy.
So to orient you a little bit, we're talking, of course, about the Mississippi Delta, and I'm not giving this in New Hampshire, so everyone here probably knows where I'm talking about. Of course, not on the coast, but in the Delta, the alluvial plain. And this is a close-up view of LaFleur County. So this is where Ed Scott Sr. first bought property, and the same property that would later become the Catfish plant. And so you'll see later there was a second acquisition that Ed Scott and the family made that expanded the footprint here, but this was where it all began, was LaFleur County. And so just a little bit of a glimpse here, some archival images that the family provided. This is Ed Scott with his car and Edward Sr. on the farm. And one thing, I'll just give a little bit of a story here. Ed Scott was not the first son. He was the seventh child. And Rose Scott, who was Ed's eldest daughter, has this recollection. And what I'm going to do during some of this, I'm going to read a few little excerpts from the book that to kind of give a little bit of life to this. But she told me, she said, "You never know why God let that last child be named Edward. He was more like his father than any of the other children. His thing is, I don't want you to sell any of my land ever." And she says, "I'm looking at this land a million years from now. This land will still be Scott's land." And that comes back because this land was taken from the family, and you'll see the importance of that quote later. And around this time, so we're going to go into a chapter of the life of Ed Scott that happened when World War II happened. And so these are his discharge papers, and he became a quartermaster in the Army. And he was proud of these Army obligations. He had his story that he wanted to be a paratrooper, but when he first started training, he saw them jumping off those big towers. He said, "I don't want to be a paratrooper anymore." But he occupied a very important role as quartermasters. For those who don't know, these were folks who primarily during this period were driving the fuel trucks across Europe to fuel Patton's march on the Western Front. And there's a great story that about Ed Scott and his truck. So read again. "He was proud of his Army obligations. His truck was near and dear to him as the tractor and the Chevy back home. He shined it with a rag soaked in linseed oil. The officers who piled in to be driven to their classes on base admired its gleam. One afternoon, an officer came over to Scott while he was polishing his tires. 'Oh, you got a good-looking truck,' he said, looking down at Scott with his thumbs in his waistband. 'What'd you do to it?' Scott, rag in hand, told him it was linseed oil and elbow grease. And because of this is a story, because of his shiny truck, the officer gave him a 3-day furlough to go back home. And so he did, and when he did, he got married. So this is a really beautiful photograph of Edna Ruth Daniel, later Edna Scott. And her father was also a farming had a big farm. They were a farming family over in Bolivar County in Mound Bayou. So this was the joining together of two prodigious African-American farming families. But as I said, Ed Scott had work to do abroad, so he proceeded to go overseas. And he was a member of, again, these quartermasters, but it was part of what was called, there was a route that you had to take called the Red Ball Express. And the red ball refers to the symbol there on the trucks. But these were groups of men, and primarily black drivers, who drove on these precarious routes with the fuel. And to give you a kind of an idea of how much, how important it was, but also how much that they carried. I'm going to read this a little bit. This was General Eisenhower. He described the Red Ball line that they traveled as the lifeline between combat and supply. To it, he said, falls the tremendous task of getting vital supplies from ports and depots to the combat troops, when and where such supplies are needed, material without which the armies might fail. And as I mentioned, the majority of truck drivers driving the Red Ball Express were African American. As many as 5,000 trucks every 24 hours traveled this route. And General Patton was also a part of this story. So Ed Scott has a couple of different interactions with Patton, one of which I'll tell you a little bit about. So he was driving trucks over there, and this was over in Germany, right towards the end of the war, and they had beaten back the Nazi troops, and Patton had sent back some of his troops for rest, but he wanted to go on a recon mission. And so he asked for a driver, and Ed Scott was a quartermaster, and he got in a Jeep with Patton, and they went on a routine recon mission. Well, about a couple miles into this, or along a ridge, a sniper starts shooting. So gunfire starts coming across the front of the Jeep, and Ed Scott and General Patton dive off into the ditch together. So General Patton, the guy they called Old Blood and Guts, him and Ed Scott Jr. are sitting here in this ditch, and there's a Nazi sniper from a bell tower church who's got them pinned down. And so, as Ed Scott remembers, Patton says he didn't either ask him or he told him. He said, "You're all right." He didn't say, "Are you all right?" He said, "You're all right." And then he called in artillery fire. These guys called the Crazy TDs, and TD stood for Tank Destroyers. And this was part of the Black Panther Battalion, another African-American group of soldiers. And they took aim from miles away, and General Patton guided them in on the walkie-talkie, and they leveled the church. And then Ed Scott and General Patton got in the Jeep and drove back. So that was his experience in war. He was freezing. There were accidents on the road. There were times when he would veer off into, where there weren't clear directions, veer off into a town that was deserted, but there was still enemy troops in there, and he'd have to flee before they blew up his truck. He was carrying fuel. So it was very precarious, and there was racism, of course, in the Corps, too. He tells a story about when he first landed in France. Some of the white officers would tell the locals that the black soldiers had tails. So this was a dehumanizing description of them. And Scott remembers that some of the French families, when they would go and be in the homes of these French people, the French people would be looking to see they would ask him, "How do you sit down with your tail?" And he had a bit of when he told this, he had a bit of a humor about it, but it was not, of course, something humorous at all. It represented racism in the peak of the 20th century, and that didn't go away when he came home. So when Ed Scott returned home, like many of these soldiers, he came from a very different world and had to return back to racism at home. And this is a quote from James Baldwin, who writes that a certain hope died. You must put yourself in the skin of a man who is wearing the uniform of his country, who is a candidate for death in its defense, who is almost always given the hardest, ugliest, most menial work to do, who knows that the white GI has informed the Europeans that he is subhuman, and who, at the same time, as a human being, is far freer in a strange land than he has ever been at home. Home, the very word begins to have a despairing and diabolical ring. And all this is happening in the richest and freest country in the world and in the middle of the 20th century. So when Ed Scott returned home, he thought about leaving Mississippi. As he said, he was proud of his uniform, but he wasn't proud of Mississippi. He wasn't proud of Mississippi at all, because when he got on this Greyhound bus, as you would expect, and as you probably has been reflected in many other stories, he was told to wait and let the white people get on first. But he pushed his way aboard and got home to see his father. And he found his father farming a lot of land. And by this point, his father had continued to acquire more and more land, but he understood that his dad couldn't do it alone. So he thought about leaving Mississippi, but he decided instead of going to college and leaving, he would stay there and work the farm. He said, you can't work this place like you're doing by yourself. And he told that to Edward Sr. He said, I'm going to stay right here with you, Daddy. And so he did. And at that time, row crops, of course, were, and cotton especially, were reigning in the Delta. And I mentioned his wife, Edna Scott. Her father's name was Isaac Daniel, and he was a community organizer and farmer in Mound Bayou. And at this point, so Edward Sr. and the Scotts are farming in LeFlore County, 2 counties over in Bolivar County and Mound Bayou. The Daniels are farming, and Isaac Daniel didn't have as much help as needed either. So Ed Scott at this point would be farming in both places, and he would help share what he had learned from his father at times to get Isaac Daniel's cotton crop growing better. And so they were really making a lot of money and expanding their operation and employing the family at every turn. So here's a little bit of here's where we started. That was the initial LeFlore County land, and now we're talking about Mound Bayou area too. And another important thing about this, so now we're talking about going into the 50s and we'll get going into the 60s, is there was a lot of turmoil happening. Obviously, civil rights movement, a lot of events. 1955, of course, Emmett Till. Tallahatchie County is the one north of LeFlore. All this stuff was happening in the immediacy, and Ed Scott had interactions and examples in both these counties of people who were fighting for change. So, in Ruleville, which is a little bit west of where the LeFlore County land was Fannie Lou Hamer, and she had started her Freedom Farm during this period after registering votes. Into the 70s, she started her Freedom Farm, which employed African Americans who had been working in dead-end sharecropping systems, gave them dignified labor, and really reinvented and rethought the way that a farm could operate and who could benefit from that labor. And then you had over in Mound Bayou a number of organizers and activists, not the least of which was Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who was a doctor but was much more than that. He helped create swimming pools and businesses and hospitals all in Mound Bayou. And Ed Scott says that he took his appendix out, so he was his doctor as well. But this gave Ed Scott 2 complementary examples of people affecting change, and that became really important. There was a thing that Ed Scott remembered when he was found in Mound Bayou. He started seeing stickers plastered to the light poles, and this was a T.R.M. Howard campaign. It said, "Don't buy gas if you can't use the restroom." So, of course, segregated restrooms were common. But I write in the book that the message Scott received was, don't let anybody tell you where and how to do your business. And that was something that became true and stayed true for him. And T.R.M. Howard's there in the middle, and Ed Scott Sr. is next to him on the right, and Isaac Daniel is in this picture as well. So this just shows, this is a little snapshot of this happening in real time, and these are wonderful family photographs. So another thing, a couple of other things that happened, again, you talk about 1960s, you've got Selma in 1965. Ed Scott was there. He brought food to marchers and activists all over the place. He followed Dr. King. So he went to Selma and triumphantly marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with that group. And in 1966, the Meredith March, the March Against Fear, organized by James Meredith initially and then picked up by other civil rights activists, came through the Delta. And once again, the family packed up meals and Ed Scott drove it down there and fed them. And this really bolstered their appetites for change. It was food, the importance of food, this common symbol of humanity that rung true in these scenarios, but also was echoed in the sit-ins at lunch counters and the access to food that Fannie Lou Hamer fought for. So I think as we go into the Catfish era, thinking about what food stands for in this fight for equality is very important. And around this period, so Ed Scott had children of his own, and they began farming rice and really going gangbusters on this farming thing. And he liked to say, because they were farming in 2 counties, that it looked like a parade when they were farming. They would go back and forth across the roads with all this equipment, and they never put any borders on their land. So you think about Ed Scott Sr. would buy one tract for Ed, one tract for Leighton, one tract for Sam, all his sons, and they just farmed it as if it was one, and they continued to do that. And in 1978, this was one of his biggest years in crop farming. Ed Scott had formed a co-op, this is referring to, and because he was the largest farmer, had the most equipment, he would enlist other farmers nearby in this Brooks Farm area of LaFleur County and help them access loans and money. But they started having a rice festival, and that's what this is. You got Son Thomas here singing. Let me give you a little example of what happened at the rice festival. The rice festival put the reaping to music. Scott staged the festival in the cavernous tractor shed. Hundreds of folks, neighboring families, and fellow farmers attended the festival. Local politicians ate late-season watermelon and drank cold knee-high. The staple singers took the stage, a flatbed trailer, in matching black. They belted out songs like Freedom Highway and nearly blew the roof off to the blue Delta sky. The Chicago trio slapped their legs as they sang, and the beat spread through the crowd. Men took off their hats and hit them against their jeans like tambourines. Children, possessed by sugar, ran in front of the stage and flailed in improvised dance steps. Bluesman James Son Thomas joined Lil Bill Wallace on stage, followed by the Delta Mace Airs of Greenville, the Heavenly Gospel Singers of Jackson, the Greenwood Jubilees, and the polished inmate musicians of the Parchman Band, bust in from the infamous farm prison. So this was a big deal because they were farming, again, $1 million in rice in 1978. So this is where all the rice trucks would come in, and this is like Uncle Ben's, Comet. They would bid on this rice, and Ed Scott's rice stood out because they would bid in a blind test. The race of the farmer was not something they knew about, so Ed Scott really excelled when his crop was able to be able to view without the race of his family being known about it. And that's a sad thing to say, but it just shows how precise they were in their farming. They knew that they couldn't just farm okay. They couldn't just get the job done. They had to go above and beyond so they could keep growing, keep expanding, and prove that they deserved their place. And so here's just a sense of how this looked. This is the rice. They're enjoying a rice shower with the dregs of the grain bin. And Ed Scott built these grain bins. He realized that obviously he's going to need a place to put them, but he put 3 of them up, and then he said, I'm going to need 5. I'm planning to grow a lot of rice. And he said that when these rice festivals would happen, it was so full of rice you couldn't get a coffee stirrer in there. So that was 1978, and here's kind of a turning point in the story, both for the industry in the Delta and then for Ed Scott. So around this time, row cropping that had been so stable was experiencing some difficulties, market fluctuations globally, just the difficulty of predicting some of the yields. So even though cotton, soybeans, rice, that would continue, there was a sense that we need to find something different. There was a Russian grain embargo, which many of you may remember, a number of these complicating factors. So catfish became, a savior for the Delta. That was the idea. And around this time, 1978, was also when Ed Scott Jr. first went to the government for his money. So for years and years, for decades, he and his family had been going to local banks, Bank of Louisville, others. They had a relationship with lenders, but he'd been told, it's easier to go to the government to get your money. And USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was indeed putting billions and billions of dollars into heartland agriculture to subsidize it, to give farmers the resources they needed to farm. Farming is too important a symbol of American democracy to let falter, and so they wanted to make sure it was afloat. So Ed Scott went to the government to get his money, and that, to be frank, is where the problem started. So what happened was Ed Scott went to the government and they said, basically, if you don't have catfish ponds, we're not going to give you any money. So that was essentially the message he was receiving. He had gotten money for a first couple years, 1978, 1979, he got a little less. But around 1980 is when they said you need to have catfish ponds. And so he, without money to dig them himself, kept farming his other row crops, but he and his son spent the year of 1980, digging out 160 acres of their land and making 8 20-acre catfish ponds, 6 feet deep. And Ed Scott talks about this coming out of his own pocket. And I'm going to just read a brief section that this quote comes from. The neighbor jerked the wheel and pulled to the side of the dirt road to watch. He got out and stood on the hood to get a better look at Scott, who was standing about 100 yards away on a bluff of freshly exposed clay in what had only recently been a soybean field. From a distance, it appeared to the neighbor as if Scott was staring into a giant crater where a meteor had landed. Even atop the hood, the neighbor couldn't see what was down there. Scott was looking down at 6 feet of absent earth that stretched for acres. He envisaged those acres full of water and thrashing catfish. Scott was on the verge of entering history as one of the first, if not the undisputed first, black catfish farmers of this size in the country. The neighbor saw Scott wave his hands and whistle. Then he heard an engine roar and saw smoke billow like it was spewing straight from the earth. The illusion only heightened the magic. Scott is speaking to the ground, the neighbor thought, and it's doing as he says. So these are two videos in sequence that I'm going to play, and this is Ed Scott telling you a little bit what happened next.
Well, I built the pond out of my pocket and with my equipment, a 20-acre pond, which I have right across the road here. And after I got them built, I needed money to stock them, and I went to Farmer's Home and asked them my money to stock them. They said no, they wouldn't give me no money to help build a pond and didn't give me none. So the local agents in Greenwood was the one I was talking to. So I left him and went over his head, went to Jackson. Now the operation I have across the road out there, I can give you the figures on it. It's a $400,000 operation. It would take $400,000 to stock them ponds, feed them out, and buy all the equipment for the fish. They gave me $150,000. And they just gave me enough money to get me in trouble and thought that was it. But I didn't let that stop me. I kept going.
So just to give it a little bit of perspective, you can see how lucrative that business was, also how ambitious it would be to try to do this without much support. And then, of course, with FMHA, which was the arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the way the money was distributed was through local supervisors. So the national agency really didn't have a lot of oversight. And so, of course, in communities where there was a legacy of discrimination in society, that would translate into discrimination if the agency supervisors also held that perspective. And to give a little bit of a cap on that, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 1982 commented that a society in which whites controlled virtually all elements of land production and development could never be equal. This imbalance reinforced the black community's long-held skepticism of American justice. So this is the tractor shed I alluded to earlier, and we're going to start here for this next little bit. So this is where, the Rice Festival, he played under the tractor shed, they parked their equipment here. But when Ed Scott finally got the money he alluded to, just enough money to get him in trouble, he did use that to stock his ponds. He couldn't stock them all because he only had a third of what he would need, but he stocked 4 of them. And his fish, he fed his fish, they were swimming in his waters, they were growing big, and he realized about this time that, of course, you're going to need somewhere to process them. And so this is when he went to the local processor, Delta Pride, which was in Indianola, and he wanted to buy some stock. So this was 1981, that plant had just opened and really ushered in this industry, and his lawyer tried to buy him some stock in the plant, which you needed because it was a co-op in order to process fish, and his lawyer called him back and said, Mr. Scott, I'm always straight up with you. I couldn't get you no stock on account of the color of your skin. So Ed Scott decided, well, that's not going to stop me. I'm going to set up a tour of Delta Pride. So he had his lawyer's secretary set up a tour of Delta Pride, and Ed Scott and his son Isaac went to Delta Pride without telling him why they were going, and they were on a tour here, and the guy's like, You know, they gave tours all the time to different businessmen and Boys and Girls Club and such. And they said, you know, do you have any stock in the plant? And Ed Scott says, no. He says, well, you got anything lived up with any live haulers, any live hauler trucks that are going to take your fish? And Ed Scott says, no. And the tour guide, Delta Price, says, well, what the hell are you going to do with your fish then? Eat them? And Ed Scott says, oh, something like that. I'm seeing what y'all doing up here that I can't do myself. And so he had gone in there and seen what they were doing, and then he proceeded to turn this tractor shed into a catfish processing plant. So he, every little bit by bit, he paid a carpenter from nearby Drew to lay down one side of concrete, lay down the other. He got what resources he could about the materials you needed, the stainless steel, and then he constructed and built atop the bones of this little tractor shed, the first ever minority-owned catfish processing plant in the nation. And then this is the plant opening. So this is February of 1983. Scott's Fresh Catfish opened on a cold, clear February day. The air pulsed with excitement. Family, friends, and newly hired plant workers milled in the gravel drive between the plant and the Scott's home. The one-line plant was smaller than any in the Delta, as far as Scott knew, but it was still larger than the farmhouse where he lived. The builder had expanded the footprint of the tractor shed and constructed a cinder block-walled main killing floor that adjoined the offices and loading dock. Wood plank siding, laid vertically and painted a bold red, covered the exterior of the administrative wing. The color popped against the adjacent concrete wall, painted white. The finishing touch, hung up just hours before the opening, was a hand-lettered wood panel that said Scott's Fresh Catfish. And the plant workers, who you'll meet in a moment, were an incredible group of women, primarily women, men as well, but there was a group called the Dependables. And these Dependables, they did everything the men could do and more. And they like to tell me that, you know, that one of the things that just happened was Billie Jean had just come out. So Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, and that was hot on the charts. And so they were playing music, and Ed Scott and Isaac, his son, did a little dance. And they weren't normally ones for the dance floor, but they got out there and danced that day. And it was very a moving and emotional time and a celebratory time, because this had finally come to fruition and set the stage for them to finally be vertically integrated, finally be able to take the catfish that were in their ponds, process them, get them to market, and gain access to this industry that had tried to keep them out. So here's a little bit of inside the plant here and outside too. These are the vats where you would take the fish from the pond and put them in here before they would get shocked, or excuse me, Ed Scott said stunned. We don't shock our fish, we stun them. They would get stunned and sent inside where the saws were. You chop the heads, gut them, fillet them, etc. And here's a shot of them filleting fish, of course. So here are the Dependables. Scott's plant workers were a close-knit bunch. One group of women called themselves the Dependables. They were part of a much larger, dedicated team that included the likes of Sophronia and Viola Carr, Diane Biest, known as Shug, Willie Mae Curry, and Daryl Scott. The Dependables worked long hours to keep the plant operating. They lived nearby and worked any and all shifts, in snow and storm, amid mud and guts. They were tough. Scott's grandson, Daniel, a teenager when the plant opened, called them mannish ladies. They did everything the men could do and more. And this is Eva Brooks. We packed fish, 30-pound boxes, and we throwed them boxes just like a man. Those men taking their time, we chucked it like it wasn't nothing. And another story about this, Essie Watson was another one of the workers, and she went into labor at the skinning table. So her water broke mid-fish. And she took herself home, took a bath, and drove herself to the hospital. And that was those are the kind of people that made this happen. Without the Dependables, without the family, without the support system, you know, Ed Scott would not have been able to do this. And so this is a kind of quaint, funny little look. Is a really nice commercial for the plant that I think you'll enjoy.
One of the newest commercial catfish farm operations is in Drew, Mississippi, the LaFleur Bolivar Catfish Processing Plant, the only minority-owned and operated commercial catfish plant in the United States. More than 500,000 catfish are kept in 8 20-acre ponds, all on 160 acres of land, where they're fattened up for the commercial market.
We sell to all over Mississippi, to hospitals, schools, and Holiday Inns, I'm going into Delta State now, and we're going into Tennessee and Missouri. We plan to supply whatever market we get. We're going to fill it.
We at LaFleur Bolivar Catfish Processing Plant believe in quality, professional service, and reliability. Just as we value our catfish, we value our customers, and we'll go an extra mile just to please you.
Don't you want their catfish? And another really important part of this was if you were at the catfish plant or in the driveway back to the plant, looking across, this is where the Scotts lived, and you'll see they built an annex to the house, and this was Edna Scott's restaurant. So they opened up a restaurant both to feed the plant workers but also surrounding farmers, and this was really the only place to get food out there. And she cooked stuff from her garden patch. She always had catfish on the menu. And people really enjoyed that, as well as her famous meal mix, or cornmeal mix, which you could fry anything in. But unfortunately, this didn't last in its current form, because the Department of Agriculture, FMHA, they still had something out for Scott. And they discovered in memos later on that there were occasions where they had scribbled 50 cents when Scott was telling him about what he needed for the land, as a evaluation of the worth that they thought he had. There was another time where they called him a big black farmer, which was to say he was out of his depth, identifying him by his race. And time again, when they found out he was doing things to improve his farm, they thought that he needed to ask permission from them. So there was this power dynamic that existed from the get-go. And around 1983, this was not long after he had finally vertically integrated everything, they began to foreclose on his land. So he still had been getting money from the government for the row crops. He got a little bit to feed his catfish, and then that next year, they decided he was too risky. And this is just important to know, is that everyone owed money to the bank. I mean, that was part of farming. It was, as I say here, as expected as wearing boots out into the field, but they would be able to give debt forgiveness at any time they wanted. This was monopoly money in some ways to the government, and they did that to many white farmers, which the Scotts later found out about. And these are hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he basically was just paying everything he could, and what little debt he had to them was minuscule, was peanuts, and yet they decided to stop funding him. So what happened after that was Ed Scott essentially lost all of his row crop land. So this is basically, I think, of 1,000 acres that the banks foreclosed on. And they also came and took the fish out of the ponds, because he had fed some of the fish with the government seed money. And so even in that commercial, which was in 1985, those ponds aren't fully stocked with fish. I mean, they weren't able to do it, and there was some staging there, but the reality was that they had set all this up, they had climbed this mountain so high, and then the government essentially knocked them back down. But Ed Scott decided to continue on, and he just became a fry master, and they continued the plant. So he started buying fish cash. He started getting relationships with other organizations. Head Start, Delta State, Alcorn State. He got minority contracts with the government. He would be shipping fish to Kansas City. And so they continued for 7 more years until 1990 to run the plant. And he would go and fry at different political events. And he actually went up in 1987 to Marion Barry's 3rd inauguration in D.C. He and the Dependables went up to D.C. and cooked fish at the house party out on the boat for Marion Barry, who was from the Delta. So this is a kind of humorous one again, but just to give you a sense of why it was such a tragedy that Ed Scott was forced out, because, as I mentioned earlier, catfish was big.
Fishing's fun, but for the catch of a lifetime, try McDonald's new crispy catfish sandwich. It's Mississippi farm-raised catfish, hand-filleted, fried to perfection, and served up on a home-style bun with lettuce and a tangy sauce. There's even Cajun-style sauce for folks who like it hot. Net the catch of your life at McDonald's with our new crispy catfish sandwich, large fries, and a medium Coca-Cola Classic. But hurry, don't let this big one get away. At McDonald's for food, folks, and fun.
I need to bring that back. And this was a letter that Scott received from another a distributor, another African American in the catfish industry, and he talks about Church's Chicken in this case also had put catfish on the menu, and there was this shortage of catfish. He's saying he wanted to take 50,000 pounds per month from Scott, and Scott wasn't able to, we're going to need at least 750,000 pounds of fish per year on a constant basis, in addition to meat what we're already buying. And Ed Scott wasn't able to, he would have been able to fill it, but he wasn't able to fulfill that dream he had and all the possibility that lay ahead because he kept getting knocked down. But then what happened, so in 1983, he gets foreclosed upon. He runs his plant until 1990. He continues frying fish even after that. But remember, Ed Scott was born in 1922, so he's not a young man anymore, and he works to try to get his land back through various programs that the U.S. Department of Agriculture had. And finally, in 1997, there was a class action suit, many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, Pickford v. Glickman, and Ed Scott joined this class action suit against the U.S. Department of Agriculture that alleged discrimination against thousands, more than 22,000 black farmers. And this is just a little clip of the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, Dan Glickman, from 1999.
C-SPAN has been inviting members of the cabinet to spend time with you to talk about their priorities for the coming year. We're very pleased to have the Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman, at our table this morning.
We were sued, that is, the Department of Agriculture was sued in a class action by a group of black farmers around the country alleging discrimination that went on for 25 years in our loan programs, particularly as they related to farmers in the South. We have settled that suit. It is going to be finally settled up later on this month. But that suit the settlement will involve a payment to some of these farmers, will involve the extinguishment of their debt. This is not a happy chapter in the history of the United States Department of Agriculture. Over the years, there's no question that there were quite a few black farmers in this country who were not treated the same way as white farmers in terms of their loans or other types of programs. And there were a lot of reasons for this historic discrimination. A lot of it has to do with the nature of how our farm programs were run in a very decentralized way through farmer-elected county committees, and in many parts of the South, particularly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, discrimination certainly continued to prevail.
So, this was some semblance of justice, but I think the really important thing about that video and the court case was that it's recognized in the public record what happened. I mean, who's ever experienced something and someone else tries to make you feel crazy that you saw it and they didn't see it? And that's something that exists and existed here on a systematic basis, widespread. There was just a sense that you were lying about what you saw. And so even though this didn't make everything okay, having the department own up to this, which they did in a number of ways and tried to fix some of the problems, was really important. And this was the judge who presided over the case. And this just puts it again in perspective again. Today, Friedman said, there are fewer than 18,000 African-American farms in the United States. And that was compared with 925,000 in 1920. And he said the Department of Agriculture and the county commissioners bear much of the responsibility for this dramatic decline. So this brought Ed Scott to the kind of the concluding chapter of this. So he was able to be a part of this case, and then it took another decade for him to finally get his individual claim heard, but he did get financial compensation. So around 2012, the arbitrator gave Ed Scott the decision, here's your compensation, but he still didn't have any of the land. It's sitting in government inventory, and it wasn't until even that next year, 2013, with all the money in hand, Walina Scott White, who's Ed Scott's daughter, happened to see in the land auction sale that all their tracts of land were coming up for auction. This was the second year that they were up for auction. If the third year comes and goes, the former owner has no claim to it anymore. She happened to see it, didn't have their name on it, and recognized the acreage, and they went and bought back all of it. So the other chapter of Ed Scott's life, he started to get a little bit of recognition. This is John T. Edge of Southern Foodways Alliance, who wrote an important piece in Civil War magazine. This is 2001. So Ed Scott finally, his story then took off. So he had done the work. He had gone through a lot of the trials, But then he was getting a little bit of celebration. This is a beautiful image of him later in life, standing by the ponds. And this is what it looked like when I came along. So we saw what it looked like earlier, the plant, and this was 2013. You know, there wasn't any need to use it, so of course it decayed. And it just brought back to me, you know, the importance of telling these stories so that the stories don't decay, so that we keep reinvigorating them and we don't forget what happened. This was the same office where he was on that camera earlier speaking to us. And this is the family plot right across from the former Catfish ponds and the plant where Ed Scott and Edna Scott now rest with the other generations of the Scotts.
This is going to go in the library, and maybe something you want to tell your great-great-grandchildren.
Well, if it's going in the library, I'd like to say it to my people. It ain't no such thing as you can't do what you want to do if you want to do it bad enough. If you put your hand and heart to anything you want to do, you can do it. So, if anybody want to read, look at this tape or read what I said, everything I said, I had to do it with the courage that I believe that God would bless me in doing it.
And now, even though Ed Scott Jr. is gone, they have the land back and the family is farming again. They're on their fifth crop, their fifth harvest. And so they've reclaimed it, they've reworked the land and tilled it up, and they're now using it again. And Willina Scott White, who I mentioned earlier, is actually pursuing a farmer's museum in Mound Bayou to tell the stories of people like her father, but also the other small farmers who embodied such perseverance and taught us so much. And, you know, I'll just say as a final point, you know, Ed Scott doesn't teach us exactly how to farm, per se. That's not his contribution, although he did that very well. His lesson is not about how to go about raising catfish, although he could teach you that too. But he and his friends in the Delta, they just illustrate what the American dream should mean, you know, what it can mean. It's equal access to possibilities, the opportunity to really pursue whatever your dream might be. And so that's something that even as contemporary people who may be separated from the land, you know, I think we can take from this story and use creativity and innovation in our own communities to share what we have with the world. So thank you all so much. So now I'd just like to open it up for any questions that y'all have, and thanks for having me again. So any questions, and we'll run a mic to you.
You mentioned there was family in the audience. Is Mrs. White here?
Did she make it? Let's any family, let's stand. There we go. And they really welcomed me in, and so I'm always will be grateful to the family for that.
Hearing this story reminds me so much of a series that's on the OWN channel, Queen Sugar, about the Bordelon family in New Orleans and how they had to process their own sugar cane. It's just amazing, and this is truly inspiring. So thank you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you.
Could you say a word or two about, since the settlement has been reached and so on, say a word or two about, since that time up to now, current USDA practices in such matters?
You know, I won't pretend to know all the details of everything that's happening now. You know, I do know, and this goes back to, you know, when Mike Espy was there in Clinton's years, there was a sense that the old guard was hanging on to these old ways of doing things, but there was a new push to do things differently. In 1996, they commissioned the Civil Rights Action Team report, the CRAT report, which was right before the Pigford case happened, and they found a number of things, this widespread discrimination. They found that these cases, these complaints that had been piling up all through the 90s and before hadn't been addressed since the Reagan administration. And so there was a lot that revealed, and then of course with the 1999 was the decision by Judge Friedman, and there was a Pigford II, so we're talking more than $2 billion, I can't remember the exact figure, but billions of dollars that got sent back to farmers, but there were still issues with access to farmers' files. They had to prove if you were a large farmer, you had to find and have access to the white farmers' files who farmed approximately the same size farm you had, the same crops, and it became impossible for many of these farmers to get access to those files. So you'd imagine that even though this was a semblance of justice, there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I think some of the farmers, Cindy Ayers locally who runs Footprint Farms, I know she works a lot with still these ongoing issues. I'm sure Willena could allude to that, but I do know that Willena, in your perspective, y'all have been able to go back to the government again because some things, at least in your neck of the woods in the county that y'all are now going to, some things have changed enough to get a little bit of equitable treatment. So I think that there's always a a systemic thing, and then there's an interpersonal thing. And so both those have to be addressed, but I think it's at least we can say that there are movements in that direction, and that there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Scott years ago. Matter of fact, I still have his card, which I will cherish. I wonder, first of all, if his family is doing the catfish farming now, and secondly, are there any black catfish farmers around? Period.
They are not farming catfish, and again, without knowing every detail, my understanding is that if you look at the Delta, all the catfish processing plants I mentioned are no longer there. The catfish boom has sort of come and gone, and so while there are some catfish processing areas and farms, Simmons Catfish, for example, in Yazoo City farms catfish, and they do it very well. But the industry is not what it once was. There's just not as many, and so I don't know of any other African American catfish farmers that are out there.
I would like for someone, maybe Matt, you could do it, the size of the Department of Agriculture in terms of its budget and also the employees.
I'm going to go and tell you I don't know the specific numbers on that. But I think those numbers are always important to know. I mean, to know how much they put into agriculture is one thing, to know how many people are associated with it. But even, I think the important thing in this story was that even with all the resources they had, they weren't able to have checks and balances on the people who were on the ground that were giving this money away. And so that's really where I think the big the travesty is that even with whatever good intentions the government may have had in terms of treating people equally, whatever it says in the letter of the law, when that gets practiced and implemented and the money gets doled out, that's where the rubber meets the road. And if there's not some kind of checks and balances and integrity there, then it doesn't really matter.
Along those same lines, did Ed Scott ever run for any of the community or county committees that do control those processes?
Well, Lena says they weren't open to blacks at that time. I do know that, so that, the answer to that, but I do know that in 1998, when President Clinton hit his initiative on race, that he was traveling around the country, they had it at Ole Miss, and Ed Scott chaired the labor committee on that. So he was part of this conversation, and I think as Willena just said, there were many opportunities where he could have taken more if they had been open to him.
Hello, Julian. This is Daniel. So I'm interested to know, after you taking this journey of doing the research, learning the history, writing the book, what has this process done for you both mentally and spiritually? Like, what have you gotten out of this whole journey up until now?
Well, it's been a transformative experience. I mean, even the privilege I had of sitting with Ed Scott and hearing him unfurl his story with such grace, that affirmed for me the importance of sharing stories and of listening to people, especially our elders. I think we can all agree that the people who came before us have a lot to teach us. And then writing this book, I came up against roadblocks that you would expect in writing a first book. And every time I did, I was able to reflect back on the story that Ed Scott would find something, that problem that needed to be solved, and he would do it. And I'd actually just remember hearing, at his homegoing when after he passed, there was a pastor who said about Ed Scott, that was his mantra, just do it. He was on the do it committee. Everything at church that needed to be done, he said, let's stop having meetings about meetings, let's just do it. And so that, I think, was something that is important. There's work to be done here in Mississippi, no matter who you are, what sector you're in. There's stories to be listened to, and there's stories to be told. And so just do it.
I just wondered what happened with the factory itself, Catfish factory. Is that still up in operation, or is it no longer operational?
It's no longer there. They've salvaged things from the plant, so because there are plans of a museum. And initially there was thinking that would be a site for a possible museum or site. It's way out in the country, so that's not exactly practical. But everything that can be salvaged to tell that story, the artifacts have been, and that's, I think, that's a well cared for place, because that's where the family cemetery is, and so I'm sure the family has some separate plans for that plot. But I know they've saved everything they could to keep the memory of it alive.
I cringe. I came yesterday to go to one of the two museums, and I was told to maybe go to the history one first before going to the African American Museum. And because I wanted to kind of prepare myself, I heard it might be a little emotional. I'm coming today to do that. But my impression when I went to the first museum, that it was very quick, very cursory, with a nice bow on the end. And I know we don't like these conversations. You kind of almost feel like you digress when you bring up violence and injustices and racism. This was done well, but I didn't hear anything about that they have to worry about their lives. Was there threatening to burn the farm down? Or because it's always that you wait and you hold your breath, that those kind of things don't happen when people just do it, when people push through. That culture is, you're just going to do it. We'll show you what we do to people that just do it. And it's not pretty. And so it's kind of like I cringe to bring that up, because we were about to end on a nice high note and we can all smile and go out. And you don't want to end with, oh, there's go that doom and gloom story in Mississippi, the Mississippi burning, family that don't want to come back down here because that image is still there. And I know we're trying to rise above that. And that's why I cringe even going in here, because I heard that this museum over here doesn't color code it. But I don't know what to expect when I go in there. And so I almost don't know if you should answer it or if I should just say it and we all kind of know what that means and we just walk out and don't let it devolve into a negative ending. But I do cringe to know if there is those things we don't like to talk about in this mixed setting, about the violence and the stuff that I heard. My grandmother just passed away at 106 last year. So I grew up with those stories, the stories that we don't talk about publicly. We just act like they didn't happen when we're in mixed audiences, but when we're in our families, we whisper about them and we know they happen because they impacted families. And so I think that's on my little story, and then I'm done. I said something like that. I said that my grandmother told me a lot of rich stories, some very disturbing, some very grounding. So there is positive, but I cringe.
I would say that you're exactly right, and I would say that this is not the place to put that aside. I don't think these museums put that aside. And mixed company is the exact place to have these conversations. We shouldn't be afraid to have the conversation in Mississippi, and we should never get too far away from the realities of life and death that exist in Mississippi. When Edward Sr. first went to buy land, he got a shotgun pointed at his face, and the guy said he's going to blow it off. And this was in Money, Mississippi, decades before Money, Mississippi became famous for all the wrong reasons, before Emmett Till. So this was in the 20s. And so that was a legacy happening there. When Ed Scott went to feed the Meredith marchers down in Belzona, he remembered after he fed them, the cop followed him all the way home, and Ed Scott thought he was not going to make it. So I think what you're saying is critically important, that the history needs to be dealt with. There should be no fear of looking at it or sharing in a conversation about it, however difficult it may be. And then on the other future-looking side of that, there are people who need to be lifted up. So as long as we can have the conversation about what is contributing to this present that we live in, we can move forward with new things, new memories, and new stories that are positive that we all can feel good about. So I think what you're saying is, the way I think about it is, it's not dwelling in the past, but it's not ignoring the past. And that's really what it is. And there is a way to move forward, but not without first reckoning with where we come from. And so I thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you all for coming today. We have reached the top of the hour. I did want to remind you all of a few things. Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who was mentioned as removing the appendix of Mr. Scott, and was a civil rights hero in the Delta in the early years. That book that was shown, T.R.M. Howard, Doctor, Entrepreneur, Civil Rights Pioneer, by David Beto, will be the subject of our August 8th program. David Beto will be here to talk about that. So their schedule's over here. Pick one up and come back for that. And then there are still a few of the delightful catfish cookies left over here. We'd like to thank the Rankin family for bringing those. And then finally, copies of Catfish Dream are available for sale right here. Julian will be glad to sign a copy for you. Help me thank Julian Rankin for this program today.